I want to think that this will be the last midweek meditation for a while, in expectation that the anticipated announcement coming Tuesday will mean the lifting of the present lockdown, which in turn would mean that in the next Sunday, many of us can be back in church. In that expectation, I'd like us to give some thought this afternoon to how has the lockdown actually benefited us? Maybe you find that a strange question. And yet it's what I've learned to ask after reading from John 15. I'm thinking of these verses. Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vinedresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because the word that I've spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned." Jesus was in the upper room where he instituted the Lord's Supper. That's John 13. Then he spoke the words of John 14, and at the end of that speech, he said to his disciples, "Rise, let us go from here." And so you can picture the disciples with Jesus getting up and heading out and walking to Gethsemane, where we find Jesus in chapter 18. Presumably along the way, they walk through a vineyard. And you can see in the eye of your mind a vine coming out of the ground with branches growing out of it. And perhaps the laborers had just been through the vineyard too to break off some dead branches and to prune the healthy ones. And so you can see cut-offs lying on the ground. And as Jesus walks, he pauses and draws his disciples' attention to that vine. And he does that to make a point. He says, verse 1, that vine, well, that's me. I am the true vine. The branches coming out of this vine, well, that's you, the 12 disciples. And my Father, well, he's the vine dresser. He's working through his vineyard, breaking off the dead or fruitless branches, as verse 2 says, as well as pruning the good and the fruitful branches, as the second part of verse 2 says. And that's because he wants more fruit. So what are we to think of this picture that Jesus draws of the vineyard? Well, as to the dead or the fruitless branches that the vine dresser breaks off, let's think of Judas Iscariot. Shortly, the vine dresser, through circumstances, will break Judas off so that he lies amongst the discarded bits of vine on the ground, ready to be gathered and burned, as verse 6 says it. Concerning the good and the fruitful branches, we might think of Peter. Shortly, the Father, as the vine dresser, will prune him through the temptations of the servant girl. And the result is that Peter's pride will be broken, his ego badly bruised, and this growing man goes out and weeps bitterly. We might say his ego is lying on the ground, ready to be collected and burned. But the result is that Peter is a less cocky man, and more dependent on the Lord's strength, the Lord's grace, and so able in turn to bear fruit for the Lord as a result of the pruning that he has received in the school of life. For our part, we commonly do not tell branches to stick to a vine. We don't even talk to the branches. But we understand that as long as branches are alive, they will naturally stick to the vine. But Jesus does talk to the branches. The disciples. And he tells them to stick to the vine, abide in me, he says in verse 4. And he does that because he recognizes the disciples are people, meaning God created them to be responsible. And we understand the reason why the disciples, branches, have to stick to Jesus, to the vine. That's because branches can't live, let alone bear fruit on their own. They must draw their sap, their nutrients from the vine. Jesus tells the disciples to abide. That's an active verb. It's something you need to do. It's because of the responsibility people have. It leads to the emphasis of the last part of verse 4, where Jesus says, as a branch can't bear fruit by itself unless it abides in me, neither can you unless you abide in me. So, the disciples concretely need to stick to the vine, to Jesus, no matter what. But that's striking. And I say that because Jesus knows that he's about to be arrested, to be crucified, to be killed. That was his whole point in the institution of the Lord's Supper a couple of chapters back. The vine called Jesus is going to be uprooted. It's going to be traumatized. It's going to be ripped apart. And yet Jesus says, abide in me. Even James, John, Thomas, Bartholomew, when you see me arrested, when you see me uprooted, when you see me crucified and ripped apart, stick with me. It's the only way to bear fruit. And as it is, when Jesus was arrested and he was crucified, the disciples did not stick with him, but they all fled, did not abide in the vine. And here's the marvel. The vinedresser had mercy. And he gathered these branches together again, not for burning, but to make them abide in the vine, that they might in turn bear fruit. With the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, Pentecost, they did bear fruit, much fruit, for the benefit of God's kingdom. But they were the better men because of what they experienced. They'd been pruned. On the other hand, Judas was thrown away to everlasting fire. Well, why is this in the Bible? Well, that's because we too are branches by covenants on the vine of Jesus Christ. Today still the Father remains the vine dresser, and he labors in his vineyard, checking over the branches of the vines, the dead branches, the barren branches. He does, according to verse 2, he takes away, breaks them off. The good branches, those that bear fruit, he prunes, that they bear more fruit. How does the Father do that today? He's almighty and free to do what he would. But in his providence, he puts particular good things or bad things on our path to break off or to prune, both of which we experience as painful. His work leaves none of us untouched. His secateurs include the closure of churches and schools and businesses, etc. The result is there's bits of us on the ground. Branches, pruned twigs, to be gathered for burning. What's on the ground may be our complacency, our taking church for granted, our assuming freedom of assembly is a birthright as Canadians. Of course, there's this temptation. We could conclude that only pruned twigs are on the ground. After all, surely the church wouldn't have dead or dying or fruitless branches like Judas was, isn't it? Well, not so fast. I do recall that passage in 1 Timothy chapter 1 where the apostle talks about Hymenaeus and Alexander making shipwreck of their faith. Ooh. So honesty does compel us to examine ourselves. Where do I fit in? Has the Lord closing me off from church signified my being pruned? Or my being dead and broken off because I'm not drawing sap from the true vine? I do think we all need to pause to examine that question carefully in relation to ourselves. There is this glorious fact. The true vine died. Yes, he was uprooted. But he arose and lives today as the source of abundant life for all who abide in him. As we are people responsible, the Lord would have us to be deliberate, to abide in him, in order that we bear much fruit. What kind of fruit would those bear who abide in him? Well, clearly, if you get your nutrients from Jesus Christ, you bear the same fruit that he bore. And what is that? To read on a little bit farther, verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love is no one than this, someone lays down his life for his friends. Laid down his life is what Jesus did. So back to the question. How has the lockdown benefited you? Would you say that you bear more fruits than previously? You care more for another, to the point of self-denial, to serve the other, even if you haven't seen the other for who knows how long? The Lord willing, things will return soon to some semblance of normalcy, as we would call it. But I think if we don't ask ourselves these kind of hard questions, it does seem to me we've missed one of the reasons of what the Lord was pursuing in this lockdown. And that'd be a shame, a waste. May God bless each of us as we consider how the lockdown has benefited us.